All right, we're back, and it's time to talk a little bit more about the contents that we find in our couple of chapters that we read for Roots of Yoga today. And you might have been like, why do you have me read so much, Dr. Ulrich? Well, the thing is, I really wanted you to look at the introductions, and I wanted you to look kind of selectively at those primary sources. And we're going to come back to those primary sources, and you're going to use those primary sources in your activities for today. So to get started, I mean, what are we talking about yoga up to this point? And the question is, if you're playing bingo at home, how many times is Dr. Ulrich going to say, so what is yoga anyway? You know, the funny thing is, I remember, I don't have it handy. Yeah. So we read out of this book, Is This Yoga by Dr. Foxen, by Anya Foxen. And I remember when she was writing that, she and I were going back and forth, and she sent me a bunch of her chapters on that and had me read through them and give her comments and whatnot, and very sweetly gave me a free copy. So the thing that she kept coming to is, what did she want to call this yoga textbook? And she decided to call it, Is This Yoga? And, you know, it's funny, since I started really thinking about yoga academically, I know I turn to my partner all the time when I'm doing something really stupid. If I'm in the kitchen going like, you know, while chopping green peppers, and I'll be like, is this yoga? Yoga. Look, I'm doing yoga. So it's funny to me that she has the title of this book just called Is This Yoga? Because when you really start looking at yoga and the history of yoga, as we're going to keep doing, you just kind of go, is this yoga? Is this yoga? What isn't yoga at any given point? So far, we've looked at all kinds of different yoga, but we've avoided a certain question that you may have thought about or not up to this point. And that is, does yoga refer to the process of yoga, to the action of doing yoga? Or is yoga actually the goal or result of those processes? In other words, is yoga the actions leading up to some result? Or is yoga itself the result, and the process of these actions we've been reading about, are they leading up to that result? So this is actually a really important nuance that might seem unexpected. Now, we're reading in this text about the roots of yoga, and they talk a little bit about modern postural yoga. So modern postural yoga generally argues, as I've said over and over again, modern postural yoga argues that yoga is these different positions that end up resulting in a healthy body or an impressive body. Think about the way people talk about yoga physique. You know, people talk about a yoga lifestyle. People talk about having a yoga body, but they don't really refer to the body itself as yoga. You know, they wouldn't say the state of being in top yoga condition, that state of it is yoga. Well, the Sanskrit sources are a little different. So Mallinson and Singleton write on page 4, in texts that teach yoga in this restricted sense, talking more about modern postural yoga, the word yoga may designate either a practice or a body of practices on the one hand, or the goal of such practices on the other. In texts that are just writing about yoga in general. So when we're reading the Sanskrit text, yoga can be the practices, the body of practices, or the goal of the practices. So it can be, on one hand, the body of practices or the goal of the practices. While today in modern postural yoga, it may be more common to understand yoga as practice of posture, breath control, meditation, and so on, in a majority of the texts that we look at, the word yoga more commonly indicates the goal achieved through these practices, although the perceived nature of what the goal is may vary depending on the text's doctrinal underpinning, what tradition the text belongs to. So Mallinson and Singleton further write, and so the way that they're conceiving of yoga in their book, we focus only on the use of yoga in the context of attainment of liberation or supernatural powers by means of prescribed psychophysical methods, and largely ignore more religious usages of the term distinct from this restricted use, such as yoga as the accrual of karma, or as religious conduct broadly conceived, as we find in the early Jain tradition. So what are they saying here? When we're looking at yoga in said book, we're looking for means of prescribed things you do with your body and your mind, or your body and mind together, in order to gain liberation or moksha or spiritual powers, supernatural powers. So I would extend that and say that really up to this point, and until we get to modern postural yoga, that is a great definition of yoga for what we're looking at. We're looking at the psychophysiological methods that are used to gain liberation or attain supernatural powers. So, yes, in the early, oh yeah, I also wanted to say, in the Indian context, yoga is most often the result in general. So, I think about a lot of times when I'm reading in magical texts, they'll say that they'll give you like 5 magic rituals, then they'll say, this is the highest yoga, Anuttara yoga. So in that sense, is it the doing of the ritual that's the yoga, or is it the completing of the ritual of the yoga? It gets confusing there. Okay. Yoga as a practice and yoga as a goal. So we have this concept of yoga as union, which is common in sort of tantric and non-dual systems, though it depends on the system. But union with what? Is it union with one's own power, one's own nature, one's own level of reality or element? Is it union with Shiva's power? Is it union of the individual and the supreme self? Is it union of all dualities, sort of samyoga bandva, which you find on page 4 as well? More commonly, as we see in modern postural yoga, people will regularly say it's yoga is union of body and mind, breath and spirit, higher self and lower self, man and God. But when we really look at the text, especially like in the Yoga Sutras we looked at, yoga is defined as disunion. So the Yoga Sutras define yoga actually as samadhi, the result, that last, the 8th limb. Although yoga, in fact, is a disunion or viyoga of Purusha and Prakriti. Think Sankhya. When Purusha and Prakriti are completely separated, that is yoga. That is the highest yoga. That is samadhi. So effectively here, if yoga is samadhi, then yoga is result. Yoga is the end goal, not the process to get there. Now, we have a couple of other commentators, and I've been reading so much Yoga Sutras commentary now. I know these guys like they might as well be my pals, but you don't have to remember them exactly. So King Bhoja argues that yoga is the separation of Prakriti and Purusha, or the dissolution of Prakriti, Purusha. Vijnana Bhikshu argues that it is aloneness, the non-separation of supreme self and individual self. So your supreme self and your individual self are completely unified and are not split apart in any way, but they're deconnected from the world. So the commentator argues that kaivalya, or aloneness, is in yoga is the same result as in Vedanta, tattvamasi, in which he calls the non-separation of abhibhaga of the individual self, the jivatman, and the supreme self, paramatman. Okay, that's interesting. We have another text called the Iswara Gita, and it has 2 forms of Gita, or we have 2 forms of yoga. Non-being yoga, in which one's own form becomes empty, and great yoga, Mahayoga, which is union with God. And in fact, when you talk about deity yoga in the Tibetan tradition, which is pretty common, deity yoga is cultivated meditations that connect one not only to the guru, their guru, but then realizing the guru is sort of a Buddha or the Buddha in and of himself. So deity yoga is then realizing one's self-identification. One works to meditatively realize they are the same as the guru, who is the same as a Buddhist deity, who is the same as the Buddha himself, who is the same as the absolute nothingness that is the totality of everything. Yeah, they're Tibetan. What are you going to do? Okay, so we'll see that various sources posit the results of union and disunion yogas with nuanced differences. Clearly, yoga as a result of union and disunion is not terribly clear. However, yoga in the Yoga Sutras, and as understood by Sankhya, would be yoga as disunion from the sense of the from the senses and the world. So Yoga Sutras and Sankhya, yoga is the disunion from the sense objects and sensory perception powers and the world. So even if you wanted to think of a devotional yoga, or from the Yoga Sutras perspective, a bhakti yoga, that would be sort of a connection to Yogeshwara, the one deity in the Yoga Sutras, the Lord of Yoga, who will aid in creating the separation of Purusha and Prakriti. So all this is to say that you should be suspect of any group that just calls yoga union, because look at all this stuff on yoga as disunion. So what about some other yoga results? I mean, if with yoga as a state of attainment, you would see that yoga can be liberation or nirvana, equanimity and skill in action, pleasure and pain-free states, attainment of power, and magic powers are other yoga results we see throughout. I mean, regardless, yoga can be all these ideas about yoga can sometimes be valid. So yoga can be a state of attainment. The phrase to practice yoga is not often found in any of these texts. That's occasionally found, so yoga abhyasa. And that's odd considering the ubiquity of the term to practice yoga in modern postural yoga. Regardless, the most common use of the term yoga is as a result, even if that result is magic powers, which I would say is one of the main results in yoga texts. Okay, so let's review for a second. What is Hatha Yoga? The violent exertion. Hatha means violent, so I can Hatena padam hatayate. That would mean like that would mean he strikes hatayate, his foot padam hatena, with fury and violence. So the violent, the forceful, the forceful method is a really good way to think of it. But I think the best way to think of Hatha Yoga is it's somaticized yoga. It's what we saw in the Yoga Sutras were so mental. Now they're very much present in the body and make use of the body. So Hatha Yoga is the use of bodily manipulation to cause results of yoga. What type of bodily manipulations are we talking about? Well, we see throughout here postures, asanas, breath control, pranayama. Then we'll also see all sorts of physical manipulations of the body, like swallowing long strips of cloth that pass through the body and clean the body out. You'll also see sexual yogic manipulation like Vajroli. Vajroli is a technique in which they use urethral suction so that the penis of the yogi can actually suck up semen and commingled sexual fluids from his consort, transform them into nectar, and push them up his spine once again, that hydraulic thing I keep bringing up. Or you also have the Kachari mudra, which is you stick your tongue out and cross your eyes, and you stick your tongue up at the top of your palate, like that, and then supposedly nectar will fall down. There's all sorts of writing on this stuff. So we'll even see phrases that could be the best way to translate them would be something like the state of yoga is achieved by means of force, hatha, or the forceful yoga, Hatha Yoga. So we do find within Hatha Yoga, we'll find sort of manipulation of winds and energy channels. None of these are found in the Yoga Sutras. When I say energy channel, I mean there are channels of energy that flow throughout our full body. Then you also have a central channel called the Sushumna that goes up your spine. And then you have the Ida and the Pingala that kind of go like this, the left and the right channel in and out and around the Sushumna, the central channel. And the idea is you can do practices that manipulate the energies inherent throughout your body through these different channels, or nadis, which actually means waters, can mean rivers. And those are pushed into the Ida and Pingala, and all of those other energies are empty into the Sushumna. Once it's in the central channel, the Sushumna, it's manipulated, moving it up and down, or ejecting it out, or ejecting it up and out and back in. It's all sorts of ways. That's what I mean by manipulating energy channels. There's none of that in the Yoga Sutras. That's straight out of the Tantras. Yes, so Hatha Yoga, like I said, Hatha means violent, and it's almost like a violent internal alchemy, forcing energies and bodily fluids upward, away from their general natural state of flowing downward. So Hatha Yoga is the yoga of the medieval era. We're not talking about the Yoga Sutras here in the same way. References to the term begin around the first millennium, so the year 1000. And in fact, we've actually recently discovered, this has just come out in the research recently, that the earliest use of the term Hatha Yoga is in a Buddhist text. So it's not, I mean, it's a Hindu practice per se, but There were a lot of people doing this. Okay, so Hatha Yoga is said to have been invented by a group called the Nat Yogis. Nat means Lord. They're also called Kampata yogis, which means split ear, because they have a specific type of earring that goes like through like the thick part of your ear, that part right there. So that's one of the ways you can recognize these guys if you're in India. And you look at the pictures of them over there on the screen, you'll see that they have those specific types of thick earrings through the ears that they get during their initiation. So these are interesting characters. We're going to talk about them a little bit more. They were founded by a sort of mythical figure named Matsyendranath, the Lord of the Fishes. And then his student was Goraknath, which could mean like the cow protector guy. And actually all over Nepal and through the Himalayas, you'll see all sorts of monuments to Goraknath, who's treated as quite a bit, quite like a local deity. So Goraknath, from his teachings of Matsyendranath, supposedly created this Hatha Yoga. And Hatha Yoga is the practices that these yogis do. They created, these Nat yogis created these physical practices, but the physical practices are actually somaticized yoga in the service of liberation and magic power via meditative and alchemical practices. So let's break that down. These guys figured out a new way to practice yoga that wasn't just meditation. It was manipulating the body. So more vicious body positions, more difficult body positions, and ways of manipulating the body to support the meditative states and strengthen the body to do prolonged meditations that would further lead to liberation, magic powers, bodily immortality. And they even did quite a bit of alchemy. Alchemy, you say? Yes. The Nat yogis regularly manipulated and consumed mercury, and it did not kill them by any means. These alchemical preparations of mercury were treated like sort of a medicine. They were thought to be medicinal that could lead, when eating progressively more mercury that's been prepared in a way that you will be able to consume it. You can do it regularly in order to lead to bodily immortality. Thereby, and they even argue that the word for mercury is actually the same words they use for the semen of the god Shiva. And in fact, some of these medical conjunctions where they would take the mercury, which is this, is the semen of God, and combine it with other substances that were supposed to be the symbolic of the sexual, the sexual fluids of a goddess. And they put those together to create this alchemical medicine that gives magic powers and bodily immortality. All right, so what about these different limbs of yoga? Are there 8 limbs, the Ashtanga yoga? Are there 4 limbs? Are there 6 limbs? Are there 84 limbs? And in Mallinson and Singleton, we see descriptions of a whole bunch of these different limbs. So far, we have really only seen the 8 limbs of yoga. Do I have those? Why aren't those coming up? I don't know what that is. Yeah, so remember the 8 limbs of yoga are the rules, the yamas, the observances, the niyamas. I've called these the do's or the don'ts, posture or asana, breath control, which is pranayama, withdrawal or pratyahara, fixation or concentration, dharana, meditation, dhyana, and samadhi. Is it an end result? I don't know, but samadhi is sort of the resolution. So usually when we hear about sort of types of yoga, we'll hear that the Bhagavad Gita has these 3 yogas, and then they'll add Raja Yoga for some reason, even though it's not in there. In fact, it has 7 types, not 3, more like 8 when you include yoga as Sankhya. All right, so what do I mean when I say yoga has Ashtanga, the Ashtanga yoga, the 8 limbs of yoga? So far we've seen these 8 limbs of yoga. However, other reckonings of different limbs of yoga are found in numerous traditions and texts. In fact, we often hear of yoga and modern postural yoga as just being called Ashtanga yoga. If you go to a yoga studio, you'll hear a lot about Ashtanga, the 8 limbs of yoga. There is even a prominent yoga that we're going to talk about in the 3rd part of the class called Ashtanga yoga. If anything, the 8 limbs of yoga in the Yoga Sutras are what modern postural yoga takes from the Yoga Sutras. It doesn't take the magic powers, it doesn't take the Sankhya's, but modern postural yoga always talks about these 8 limbs. In fact, we see in the Roots of Yoga here that there are many lists of yoga limbs. And while 8 limbs became the most prominent, there are many more. Look at the chart on pages 9 and 10, and you'll see there's tons of different types of yoga. So yoga is said to be 8 limb, ashta, 8, 8, and anga. Anga, what does anga mean? Anga means a limb or an auxiliary. So in the Oxford English Dictionary, you can look up auxiliary, and you see an auxiliary is a helpful thing, an assistant, an affording aid, rendering assistance, giving support. So these 8 auxiliary yogas are assistants to attaining yoga, and we see them right. Blah, blah, blah. Sorry, I got my quote wrong. So on page 7, you see they write, there, while the angas may be indispensable for reaching the goal, they may themselves not be considered as yoga, but as auxiliary methods for attaining yoga, and may be subsidiary to other methods. 8 limbs, any one of them are dependent, and they might be dependent on something else. But all what they are doing is they are not the yoga themselves. They are the means to get to the yoga. So when we're looking at all these different lists, we're not really seeing a difference in yoga, that we are, if we look at the text. We're looking at a difference in the types of things and the amount of things that can lead to the result of yoga. So we find 4-fold, 6-fold, and 8-fold. 6-fold varieties have a lot in common with the 8-fold. However, the 8-fold is, well, actually, when you look at the 6-fold, and I'm thinking about, like, there's a 6-fold in the Mahabharata, and there's a couple of 6-fold yogas I can think of. They have some variation, and they overlap to some degree with the 8 limbs. When you start seeing anything that says 8 limbs of yoga, they're really going to stick with the 8 limbs of yoga, and they're pretty similar. Anytime they say 8 limbs, it's going to be these. All right, so the 8-limb yoga should be better translated as the yoga that is attained by means of the 8 auxiliaries, rather than the yoga of 8 limbs. So again, what are we getting at? These 8 steps of yoga are meant to get you to the result, which is yoga. The 8 things you do as yoga are not yoga themselves, but they are the steps on the path and the methods for attaining yoga, which is liberation, bodily immortality, and magic powers. Gotta have the magic powers. All right, let's move on. So one weird thing we find, at least to us as we're reading in these yoga texts, is that there are long-standing, even ancient strains of argument that yoga is dangerous. So you'll even find a text that advocates doing yoga practices, but they'll also say, whoa, yoga is really dangerous. Or they'll say, here are these teachings on yoga, but if you do Hatha yoga, it's really dangerous. I've heard and read about many modern yogis, thinking like 19th century up till now, and many of these modern yoga teachers will argue that Hatha yoga, the violent exertion, they'll actually say it's dangerous and unhealthy. Some people even state that pranayama, the breathing exercises, in particular, can cause illnesses at worst, or that'll just stimulate the mind, which gets in the way of any type of meditation you're going to use. Some scriptures dismiss Hatha yoga altogether, considering it to be dangerous. It is hard to argue whether these arguments for yoga being dangerous is about them, the authors figuring out physiological danger, or is it about they just don't like Hatha yogis? Remember, there's this disdain for yogis, for the practices of yogis. Other scriptures will make a stress on non-physical yogas, sometimes calling them Raja Yoga, once again, the kingly yoga. One late text actually argues that the strength and power of Raja Yoga is through using sexual yogic methods. Raja Yoga, however, don't think about it too hard as being about sexual methods. That's only some texts. Should be considered more mental and meditative yoga at its roots. And remember that Swami Vivekananda reinterprets Raja Yoga as almost a completely meditative mental yoga. So how does one even begin? How does one get started doing yoga? Well, it requires preliminaries. I mean, the preliminary practices are really diverse, but they all really differ from modern postural yoga. I mean, and they're pretty intense by comparison. I mean, if you want to do modern postural yoga, what do you need? You need to drive to the studio, you need a yoga mat, but they'll probably give you one if you don't have one. You need some bakshish, you need some bucks to pay for the yoga class. You need a jug of water, you need some free time. Those are your preliminaries. Well, things get a little bit more intense in the traditional world of yogis. The traditional yogi is required to find a place to do yoga, and that place of practice may be urban or rural. Now, we have this idea of a yogi living in a hut in the middle of the wilderness and whatnot, but a number of instances in the yoga scriptures say that the yogi's hut should be near people so he can get alms, material support, teach other people, whatever. So we have an idea like these yogis are supposed to go off into the wilderness. Most of our records, and actually when you really dig in the text, it talks about them not being completely rural. Now, some preliminaries for practicing yoga, the getting ready stuff you do, can mean taking vows and observances like the yamas and the niyamas, but it can also mean clearing away defilements. We gain defilements just by virtue of living in the world. So some of these preliminaries are vowing to both do and do not, but also to clean inherent defilements. Perhaps the many preliminaries are actually those physical first limbs that make the way for mental later limbs. Remember, like the first four limbs of the 8 limbs of yoga are body stuff you do with your body positions, your do's, your don'ts, your breathing, and then it's like the latter 4, they're all mental. Maybe those are preliminaries and the others are later. It's hard to really say. I wonder often about the 8 limbs of yoga and whether the 8 angas should be seen as a sequence of practices. And if samadhi is yoga, samadhi is the yoga that you're shooting for, that sort of makes sense. Those first 7 steps would lead up to the 8th step. The other question that we think about at least I think about when I think about yoga in the West is, what about a guru? Now, guru just means heavy. It literally means someone who is heavy with good qualities. Guru guna, you could say, heavy qualities. A guru is a heavy dude. A guru means one who is heavy with qualities. None of this guru nonsense, a guru generally tends to be a teacher, but it's not exactly a teacher. Like you can have a teacher who's just called an acharya, who is someone who teaches you something, but a guru is like a teacher you're completely devoted to. Okay, so in these yoga texts, we don't see that a guru is required, and we don't find sort of prescriptions for how a guru initiates a student, but they always say the guru is incredibly important. Now, contemporary Hatha yogis, as we'll see when we get to them, actually all describe initiation to a guru and into the lineage of the guru. So if the guru is a dasnami, you're going to be a dasnami. If your guru is a naga, you're going to be a naga. And the thing is, these traditional Hatha yogis, they would only have, like 5 or 6 students, not like, traditional yoga teachers who can have hundreds of thousands or at least 20 or 30 in any standard yoga studio. All right, so the importance here of a preliminary in Hatha yoga would be you'd have to find a guru. The guru would have to accept you. You would have to be initiated. And then the guru would start giving you the oral, verbal, specific training that you'll go then and do. They don't read a lot of scripture. The guru tells them what to do, just like his guru told him beforehand. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about today are the Shatkarmani. So when you talk about the Shatkarman, one, synonymous with the magical rituals that I study called the Shatkarmani. Well, I think we're going to talk about those later, which are sorcery texts. But the Shatkarman just means 6 actions. Now, there's a lot of actions. They're not just 6, but with lists in Sanskritic culture, it could say it's a list of 6 things, but it might have 80 things in it, and it'll still be called a Shatkarman. So notice that the majority of these cleansing rites have to do with the alimentary canal, from the mouth to the butt. It's all the way through your whole digestive system. These practices sort of range from cleansing your nose, focusing your eyes, passing a long strand of cloth through the digestive tract, manipulating stomach muscles to improve digestion, genital purifications. And they'll do all sorts of stuff with bodily movements of the stomach and strengthening stomach muscles and whatnot to supposedly improve the way that you can digest properly. So these days we've got 6 rather tame actions that I'll list here. But when you get to the activity today, talking about the preliminaries, you'll see that there's a lot more than 6, and a lot of them are pretty hardcore. hardcore goes. I mean, they're just more intense in this. So neti is cleansing the nose, nasal lavage, from the neti pot. We've all seen neti pots. You get your neti pot, you put it in here, you put the water in there, and it goes to the back of your mouth, and suddenly your nose is and stuff. It's a good thing to do to clear out your nose. But they would argue that you start doing that so you can do your yoga practice better. Dauti is cleansing the stomach by water flush or cloth strip. So that's consuming large amounts of water and manipulating your stomach to cleanse out the guts. And like I said, they also have this thing where they'll take meters of clean white cloth and progressively swallow them very slowly so it passes entirely through their body. Nauli, which is stomach muscle churning to improve digestion. So that's like wiggling your stomach muscles in kind of this nutty way. And I've seen guys that can actually rotate their stomach muscles like around like that, almost like the face of a clock. And that's what's this Nauli. Basti, which is cleansing the rectum through enema suction. So enemas. Kapalabhati, that is pranayama or breathing exercise that forcibly expels all the air to cleanse the lungs and the head. I mean, just I can't do without coughing like crazy. I used to, but the idea is you breathe out really hard to get all the air out, all the bad impurity air out of you, so only clean air can come in. And they'll do this like really hard a bunch of times to cleanse the head, to cleanse that. And finally, Tritaka, which is a focusing of the eyes until watering. So it's like you like kind of really focus your eyes until tears come out, and that's supposed to cleanse your eyes. Do people do these before practicing yoga? Well, some people actually do. But in modern postural yoga, these are kind of the tame ones. We're going to see a lot more in our activities later. In the past, there were a lot more. And as seen in the text, there are a lot of variations on this. All right, so the next thing we're going to do for our next module is we're going to look at yoga and yogis again, and particularly look at sinister yogis. So get ready for some scary yogi stories. This reading can feel a little bit long. I'm going to give you one chapter out of a book, but it's just tons and tons of stories about kind of like mean, wicked, sinister yogis. So as you're reading, think about the stories you really like, because we're going to do an activity where you summarize and maybe even rewrite one of these yogi stories in your own perspective. So that's the end of our twofold lecture today, and I hope you enjoy yourself and whatever you're doing with the rest of your time before our next class. Take care, and I'll see you next time.